If you want to help Myth Vision Podcast grow, you can join our Patreon. There are different tiers, as well as help out with PayPal. Thank you so much. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment. Dr. Price, I have a question that I would like to ask pertaining to the structure of our synoptic gospels, and this goes into the origins of Christianity somewhat. My question is, with all this topic of the Q document coming up and trying to figure out what primitive sources were used or what existed as what we call Christianity or primitive Christianity to some degree, the chronology of our Gospels go Mark in priorities. Mostly everyone agrees with that. It's consensus. And if Mark is more of a Gentile type of document that seems, as some say, written to Romans or in Rome, something of that effect, and Matthew comes borrowing from Mark in some degree, I mean, everyone agrees that most of Mark is in Matthew, but he does something really weird theologically compared to Mark. Mark has Jewish ideas in it. It has Jewish theology in it. But Matthew makes it extremely xenophobic, it seems, or at least to some degree, very pro-Jewish. Almost, I would use Israel only, in the sense of Jewish only. And, you know, I only came for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Or Matthew 1 verse 21, I used this with Dr. Goodacre on the camera, where I said, his name shall be called Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins. It's almost like that John passage, in a sense. And I know I'm jumping to a different gospel, but I kind of want to give the example where Caiaphas prophesies, and he says, it is better that one man dies for the nation, not all nations, the nation, than for all of us to go. So it seems like the Jews had a us, mentality, and Matthew nails that in hard. In some of these passages, when you look at their parallels, like in Mark or in Luke, he leaves out. Mark and Luke don't talk about only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. They don't want, you can tell, to paint that kind of picture. Why is, in your opinion, maybe a good guess even, would Matthew change Mark if Mark comes before it? And doesn't that say something about earlier Christianity to some degree? I mean, was earlier Christianity Israel only, Jewish only? Or is there multiple splinter sects competing here at the very outset? How do we know? How can we know what the beginning of it was all about? So I'm asking God on camera, named Dr. Robert M. Price. I'm just kidding. So you better answer this and be correct. No, I'm just kidding. What are your thoughts? Dr. Palmer?
Well, I do think that there's this multitude of competing interpretations and so forth, possibly because they had different origins totally, as when 2 Corinthians and Galatians speak of another Jesus. That could just mean another understanding of Jesus, could easily mean that, but it really makes you wonder, especially when you read about Jesus ben Ananias, who's so parallel to the Passion narrative. But the fact that Mark is before Matthew, and I just think that's got to be so, because you can make so much sense out of Matthew by seeing a pattern of his changes to Mark. That shows, and now Mark appears to be insecure in his knowledge of Judaism. He seems to assume that his readers don't know about it. Like in chapter 7, he says, well, the Jews don't eat anything they get at the marketplace before they tithe it and all this stuff, and they wash down all their utensils and so on in a ceremonial way. And it's like you're watching the Travel Channel or something. Here's a bunch of eccentric, quaint people that do this and that. And he then has Jesus debating the scribes over the text of the Septuagint, which neither one of them would have been reading, and there are problems there. He does also have this statement in Mark 7 that really it's not what goes into you that can defile you, it's what comes out of you, your deeds and words, that defiles a man. And Mark adds, doesn't even have Jesus say it. Mark comments, thus he declared all foods clean. At least that's one translation. Another one's even worse. If you take this as cynic type sarcasm, he may be saying this food that supposedly defiles you winds up in the toilet anyway, so what's the difference? I mean, that's really mockery of kosher laws. But let's assume it does mean he declared all foods clean.
That's Pauline, right?
Yeah.
So that means he knows, and I'm sorry I have to probe because this is me getting to the origins, right? That means Paul, he's using Pauline theology. And my question then, because if Matthew comes after that, we're trying to find out, like, what's the earliest form of Christianity? Was it Gentile and then Jews grabbed a hold of it? Was it Jewish only and then Gentiles evolved out of it? You know, these different competing different ideas come up. Or were there simultaneous different sects that were rooted at the same time during this period in this cosmopolitan of ideas and mystery schools and all this stuff going on? There's no way to know with absolute certainty any way you put it. But I ask that because even when you date your Pauline epistles and you say, look, we can see redactions, we see issues, all this stuff, interpolations, etc., and they're dated later, do you date Paul prior to Matthew or Luke, or earliest, Mark? Do you date Paul even earlier than Mark, even if you date them later? You do date Paul would be the earliest documents, you suspect?
Not necessarily. I don't think there's any way to tell because like when it looks like Paul has an earlier form in the sense that there's no historical Jesus material in it, that could just indicate a chain of teaching from an early kind of Christianity that survived for a long time, even after Jesus was historicized by others. There's no way to know that, there's no way to put them in a definite evolutionary sequence, though you can with individual documents. Like Mark seems to be more Gentile and more Pauline, and it does kind of sound like he knew about Paulinism, if not Paul, not only because of the crack about the all foods are declared clean, but also because of the great story of the so-called strange exorcist, as if there was anything as a non-strange exorcist. And the power of Christ compels you. And all that. Well, who is this guy supposed to be? Oh, master, you'll be pleased at this. We ran into a guy who's working our side of the street, casting out demons in your name, but he wasn't with us, so we told him to cease and desist, or he'd be hearing from our lawyer. And Jesus says, you did what? You really think a guy who's doing miracles in my name is an enemy? Look, whoever isn't against us is on our side. Who could that be about? Well, best guess is it's Paul. And I mean, it could be anybody we don't know, but we do know of an ideal candidate for the job. And but not only that, Mark has an almost Marcionite view of the 12, that everything they say and do is wrong, or at least stupid. And I mean, everything. And finally, one of them denies Jesus and another one sells him out to his enemies. And there's never any reconciliation. Or one is implied, go to Galilee and there you'll see him. But it doesn't happen because the women are equally dense and they disobey the angel. What is going on here? I mean, this is not a person that accepts the authority of the glorious 12 apostles. No. They're just dunces. And this sounds an awful lot like Marcionism, which means it's not that primitive, but it is in comparison with Matthew. What does Matthew do with the 12? Well, there's a couple of layers, at least, of Matthew. And so you have a tendency for Matthew to correct Mark, to restore Peter's and the James and John's reputation. It's no longer James and John who have the nerve to go up to Jesus and say, "Oh, Lord, we'd like you to grant us whatever we want, a blank check." Okay, what do you want? And so, well, we'd like the reservations at your left and right hand, the seats of power in your regime. And Jesus says, "Look, you don't know what you're talking about," and so on. Well, and the rest of the 12 are giving him the daggers for this a stunt. Well, they look pretty bad, but not in Matthew, where it's their mother who comes to say, "Won't you give my boys this honor?" And they're saying, "Mom, please." It's like he knows it's bad, and he doesn't want the actual disciples to look bad. So that's one. Let's see. In the story of the confession of Peter at Caesarea Philippi, Peter gives the right answer. You're the Christ. And Jesus says, "Okay, now that you know that, you ought to know this. We're going to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man's going to have the hell beat out of him and be crucified and die." And Peter rebukes him, and he turns on Peter and says, "Out of my sight, Satan!" You think as men do, not as God does. But he really punctures the balloon. Well, what happens in Matthew? Not that. He says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," which is much grander. And my bet is that he just cut the rebuke, though it's been restored. But he goes on to say, "Blessed are you, Peter, for this has not been revealed. This is not your own idea. Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you," which is a takeoff from Paul in Galatians. "But rather my Father in heaven. Furthermore, you are the rock on which I will build my church. The gates of hell will not be able to prevail against it. I give you the keys of the kingdom," etc., etc. How did Mark just leave that out? Well, he didn't. He never heard of it. But what Matthew has done is to give Peter this great primacy. Yeah, you see, he's number one. Well, somebody else later said, "I don't think he's so great." And so he, I think, added back the rebuke. He has Peter say, "God forbid, Lord, this must never happen to you." And he's, "Oh, yeah, smart guy." But then he goes on to the keys of the kingdom thing anyway, as incongruous as it seems. And then, worse yet, a couple of chapters later, Jesus says to the whole group of them, "I'm giving you the authority, so whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven." What's the matter? Couldn't trust Peter with it? He's got to spread it out to all of them. In Mark, Jesus walks on the water, and everybody is amazed naturally. But Matthew has that. And somebody has first added Peter alongside him. Peter's just as good as Jesus. He's scared and says, "If that's really you, then have me walk on the water to you." And I think the logic is to show me you're not a ghost that can float without gravity. Well, I know I'm not a ghost, so if you can let me do the same thing, that'll prove it's really you too, in a body. I think that's the point. And it says, so he walks over the water to Jesus, implying that he got there. But then somebody who's not such a Peter fan has added to the story where even though it says he walked to Jesus, now, no, he's beginning to walk to Jesus, but suddenly, like Wile E. Coyote in a Roadrunner cartoon, says, what am I doing? I'm walking on the water, plonk. And Jesus says, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Yeah, why would a guy doubt about walking? Anyway, well, again, he's making Peter look so bad after all, and so forth. So what's happened here is that you've got one redactor of Mark who tries to rehabilitate Peter, and another one who says, oh, I'm undoing that. I can't actually cut this stuff out, but I can correct it by having the last word on it. And so, and then some of the stuff Matthew adds, and there's quite a bit of it, is sort of rabbinical hair splitting about what you can and can't swear by in an oath. Oh, can't swear by the temple, that's the throne of God, but the gold on the temple, now that's another story. Is what? What are you talking about? There's Qumran style stuff. Don't say to your brother, your spiritual brother, Raka, empty head, or whatever other ones, because if you do, you'll have to go before the Sanhedrin. What? You make a wisecrack against your brother and he takes you to court before the Sanhedrin? Caiaphas, no, it's just like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the ruling council of the Matthean monastic brotherhood. There's all sorts of Jewish stuff, also these fulfilled prophecies and so on. So yeah, you've got and plus, oh boy, Jesus is made into a new Moses all over the place in the Sermon on the Mount, like Mount Sinai, the 5 blocks of teaching attributed to Jesus in the gospel, the nativity story based on that of Moses, and so on and so on. So Matthew's gospel has Judaized Mark's gospel. Now, was Pauline Christianity on the scene before Jewish Christianity? Who knows? In Rome, maybe it was. It's not like the early church was a monolithic unity. Plus, there are good reasons to think that Matthew was composed in Antioch, which was a multi-ethnic congregation. Matthew, we know, was a scribe. He pretty much describes himself in chapter 10, a scribe trained out of the kingdom of God and all that. He knew 3 languages because he opportunistically quotes from the Hebrew, the Aramaic, and the Greek as it best fits the point he's trying to make. And we know that there was this standoff between Cephas, or Peter, I guess, and Paul in Antioch. And there were 3 parties there. The rigid Judaism party, represented by the men from James. Then there was the Pauline party, which had Jews and Gentiles eating together, kosher laws out the window. And then there was the Peter and Barnabas compromise segment that didn't want to offend James and the others, and that Paul couldn't stand that. Well, I think all 3 of these are represented by different materials in the Antiochene Matthean gospel. For instance, you've got different views of the mission to the Gentiles. You have the Great Commission at the end of it, go and teach all the nations. But it's like Matthew in that you've got to teach them everything I taught you, which has to include the keynote Sermon on the Mount, which tells you must keep every commandment of the Torah. Right? And then there was the original view that no mission to Gentiles. That's represented by like Matthew 10, go nowhere among the Gentiles, don't enter any village of the Samaritans, but go only to the house of Israel. You're not going to have time to go to anybody else. Plus, I think, the otherwise inexplicable statement in Matthew 23, woe to you who who crisscross the Mediterranean to make a single stinking convert, and when you do, he's twice the hell spawn you are. I think that's got to refer to the Pauline Christian mission as viewed by the real stick in the mud Israel-only crowd. Not that they wanted to see Gentiles in hell, they might have, but we know from the Old Testament, some of the prophets pictured a day when Gentiles would see who had been right all along and make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Okay, teach us the Torah. You were right, we were wrong, we want to know now. And you're not going to need a mission in that case. So don't rush things. So I think you've got that, and there's other things that represent one or another faction. Why aren't they reconciled? Simply because the views in Antioch were never reconciled, but they still had some sense of identity, and so it was a compromised document, precisely like the Vatican II documents. They had liberal and conservative factions theologically, liturgically, etc. So they wound up writing these authoritative documents that contradicted one another, because it was designed so, like Casamon said about the New Testament, wherever you're at, there's a piece of ground you can stand on. And yeah, that's right. And so I think that's what happened in Matthew. It does represent different factions of early Christianity, but there's no way to know which was earlier. Like it may well be like Frank Zindler and some of the earlier mythicists said that it grew out of Alexandrian philosophical/Gnostic Judaism, and later went up to Palestine, where it got Judaized in a different sense and became rabbinized and so forth. Who the heck knows? Matthew is against Marcionism, just like Mark. Well, Mark is Marcionite, I think, basically, in a primitive form anyway. Matthew is against it because what does he say in the Sermon on the Mount? He takes a cue saying that says it's easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for a single stroke of the law to pass. So it ain't going to happen ever. But he adds to that stuff that isn't in Q. It says, don't go thinking I've come to abolish the law and the prophets, the scriptures, in other words. No, I've come not to abolish but to fulfill. And whoever keeps the least of these and teaches others to do so, he's high on the totem pole in the kingdom. But whoever breaks them and teaches others to, watch out. Who's saying that? Is Paul actually saying Jesus came to abolish the scriptures? Now, he doesn't say that, right? He has a more nuanced position, but Marcion, yeah, to hell with the Old Testament. Well, he wouldn't say that. It's just not a Christian scripture. We're not using it. And who else? Or Matthew, how about when he has the scene where I think Luke has another version of it, the last day, the people will come knocking on the pearly gates and say, Lord, let us in. And Jesus will say, gee, I'm sorry, your name's not on the list. And so, no, it must be. Don't you remember we did miracles in your name? We cast out demons in your name? Sorry, it's just not here. Depart from me, you antinomians, you anti-law types, nomos, law. He doesn't just mean they're wild sinners. He means they've departed from the Torah. Who might that be? It's got to be Pauline Christians. I could go on, but yeah, there are different views and different types of Christianity. Matthew has Judaized Mark, but who knows which came first? We can say this document's earlier than that document.
Right. Even if Mark did come first, that might be the first gospel written. Doesn't mean that was the first type of Christianity.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.